Here is Sailor Studio 673. The swatch might make you think that this is a red, but the writing sample and the chromatography say this is a true brown. There can be a tiny bit of tone shift as paper changes, and some papers really draw attention to the red undertones in the ink. It has a gentle shading that isn't dramatic in its execution. On some non-fountain pen friendly papers, it does feather just a little bit, but not enough to detract from what you have written. I do love brown inks, so without a doubt would love a bottle of this. So if you have it and you don't like it, maybe let me know.
The pen for today is a Pilot Vanishing Point. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we can see that beautiful brick brown, slight red lean in the writing. Outstanding. No feather, no spread, great shading throughout all of it. If you want proof, just look at proof on the second line, where the beginning of the P is a little darker than the loop of the P. The R darkens up a little bit. The U in the middle does lighten. The F becomes darker again. It's as if they took a little bit of time and constructed where some of the shading goes. Now, when you look at constructed on the third line, the C is a little bit darker with the O. It's the NST lighten up some. The R gets a little bit darker. The UCT works from lighter to darker. TED at the end is a bit darker all the way. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Mnemosyne.
Here is Sailor Studio 750.
Here is Sailor Mnemosyne Yamabuki.
Here is Sailor Ultramarine.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does have some shading, not as much shading as there was on the Clairfontaine, but definitely still there. We see something very nice. I like how the X plus Y is nice and dark, works its way a little light to dark, and even goes light to dark. I like the shading and how we're seeing here. It draws the eye in to the word on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit more red leaning than it was on the Clairfontaine. That is an effect of the paper, being that it's a tone paper affecting the tone of the ink that we're seeing, meaning this ink is just slightly translucent. Not a bad thing, just a thing that simply is. Still doesn't feather, doesn't spread, shades very, very nice. Shades just about as well as it does on the Clairfontaine, though it's not going from as light to as dark. It's shading just as well, but in a narrower range of tones. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, shades just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. It definitely stands out from the quad rule with no problems whatsoever. Really making me happy in what I'm seeing here. If this is what you like as your paper and you enjoy brown inks the way I do, go for this one. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more brown inks.
Here is Diatramentis Nikola Tolstoy Khaki. Here is Lamy Topaz. Here is Levenger Cocoa. Here is Mont Blanc Toffee Brown.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter and a little bit flatter than it is on the Clairfontaine. As also, I think, shows off a little bit more of the red undertones as a result of this paper. It has a tendency to sort of absorb certain effects of the ink. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, I think, just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. But again, just dealing with lighter tones in what's happening, flatter tones in what's happening. I think this is a good ink for students to use in their note-taking because it's standing out against this quad rule with no problem. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Diplomat Orchid.
Here is Monteverde Emerald Green.
Here is Tasha Sharoku Kiami.
Here is Diamine Presidential Blue.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is lighter than we got on the Clairfontaine, also showing off much more of that red undertone. Now, we only get minor feathering that does occur through some spots. Not a huge deal. It does not stop you from wanting to use it on this paper. I think it's doing a great job. I don't think this is really the alternative to use as a red in grading, but it wouldn't be horrible. It has minor spread, which would be expected on this paper, and it does still shade. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting. What a great ink for this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Pilot Vanishing Point has a dry medium nib, so it can show some of the red undertones a little bit easier. Off camera, I went with a wet medium, and it significantly raised the red undertones and brought it to a place that I just didn't care for. For this reason, I think the ink needs a slightly dry to dry pen, slightly dry from wet to dry, of any nib size, but would likely stay at its best in a dry fine or a dry medium.